In the last section of this module, we are going to focus on ECGs or electrocardiograms. You'll hear me probably use EKGs, which is the same thing. So EKGs and ECGs are the same. EKG is the British pronunciation, so they spell cardiogram with a K. And it's the original version, and for some reason it got stuck in my head when I was in school, and so I use them. But just remember, interchangeable, EKGs and ECGs, which again stand for electrocardiograms. And what you need to do for the objective for this is be able to associate cardiac cycle landmarks with ECG tracings and be able to recognize when something is wrong. Right? So that's pretty simple. We don't need you to become an ECG expert, but you need to be able to look at a tracing and go, oh, like that doesn't make sense. And you need to say, okay, well, what doesn't look right? And then what could that possibly mean in a broad general sense? So I'll give some examples once we get through the basics. So in an ECG tracing, we're going to have several working parts, and I'll give you the definition here, and then we'll move into a diagram and we'll walk through each of these. So first is, as you can imagine, what an ECG is going to do is it's going to measure electrical current. Okay? So as ions move in depolarization form for a muscle contraction, they are measurable by looking at the electroactivity. So when sodium ions come rushing into the cell, those ions work just like electricity. We can put on monitors in order to be able to monitor that electricity and see what they look like. So in general, when we use an ECG, we're measuring waveforms. So the first thing, as you can imagine, that happens as we just walk through the cardiac cycle is that the atria contract. So at this point, if you think about the beginning of the cardiac cycle, atria are filling with blood. Most of it is just going straight into the ventricle, no electrical activity. The first electrical activity that we see, again, is the contraction of the atria, which delivers the last about 30% of the blood into the ventricles to fill it up. When we see this, we see a small wave known as the P wave. Right? Next, the P wave, we have a pause. Again, that's about a 0.10 second pause, and that is the electrical signal spreading through the atrioventricular node, pausing, and then into the ventricles. We then get a very common QRS complex, which is ultimately what we see as ventricular contraction or depolarization. So one of the things that you'll see is that atrial relaxation or repolarization, the flow of ions back in to reset that action potential or the resting membrane potential is going to be lost because of the size of the QRS. Again, we'll see these and walk through each of these. Then we'll see the movement of ions back into the ventricle for repolarization, and that's a T wave. So let's go ahead, jump out of the words and into a figure, which I like much better. Okay, so again, if we start out, here is your very normal EKG. So you have no electrical activity. What's happening here is the atria are filling with blood, filling blood into the ventricles. We then get a contraction of the atria. So one thing I'll note that's apparent here is the size of the wave is related to the amount of muscle mass doing the contractions. So as you can see in this QRS complex, our ventricles are much, much larger than our atria, and so the size is much smaller. So the size of the blip on the ECG is much smaller than a large muscle mass. So as I was saying, you should know what's going wrong. So if we see maybe an upside down P wave, or maybe we see some diseases called what's called a biphasic P wave, or maybe you see no P wave at all. What that would tell us is there's something wrong with the atria, right? It's something wrong with atrial contraction, okay? Then we have this about this pause that's anywhere from 0.08 to 0.1, or about 1 second, 0.1 seconds. It's a very specific time. Again, this is the pause that allows filling of the ventricles, right? We then have this, again, very distinct QRS complex. You just need to memorize what that kind of looks like. in the rapid contraction of skeletal muscle fibers. Lost somewhere in here is an atrial repolarization curve. But because this is such a large magnitude, ventricular depolarization is completely blocking out any atrial repolarization that we could see. Right? So you just have to know it's there despite it not being seen. We then have a delay, and then our repolarization of the ventricle occurs, and we call that the T wave. So again, if we think about other things that could do something wrong, if we had a QRS complex that looked like this, as opposed to the nice tight one, that's not the best drawing there, but you can imagine if we get some wide, then we're thinking, okay, maybe something is happening in the ventricles. One other thing that I'll note, or we'll see in the next slide, is that if you look, everything should kind of be centered around this baseline, right? So in a normal EKG, we can draw, getting crowded with colors, but we can draw a single line that essentially is the baseline. Any deviations from this baseline are also going to have important connotations to them. So you may say, okay, that's really nice. So why do we use EKGs or ECGs? It's because they have really great diagnostic value. In fact, as exercise physiologists, one of the common things that we're able to do is perform exercise tests to look for essentially cardiovascular disease or heart disease and suggest that someone may be subject to having a heart attack soon. So what we can do is we can put them on a treadmill, do what's known as an exercise stress test, where they go to a pretty intense effort and look at an ECG, because what happens is earlier, as we mentioned, those the coronary arteries, if they have any type of blockage in them, what they will do is they will actually have an effect on this ECG. And indeed, this is what we see in this next figure. In an ECG, what we have is this baseline is no longer consistent. So what we call this is essentially ST segment depression. Again, you should just note, oh, something doesn't look right. We can say what doesn't look right is this segment of the diagram. This is one of the most important ones because, like I said, this is what exercise physiologists would see. This suggests that there's some type of lack of blood flow in the body or in the heart that is causing this abnormality, and it suggests that that person may be at high risk for a heart attack. If you saw this as an exercise physiologist in the test, you would immediately call a cardiologist and say, hey, we need to get this guy into the cath lab to do some type of angioplasty or balloonplasty, something, because they have likely blockage in their coronary arteries. But everything else, so again, if we look at this one looks normal P wave, QRS nice and tight, and a repolarization of T. Just to review, this is the atrial depolarization, ventricular depolarization, and atrial repolarization, and this is ventricular repolarization. So it's a very, very cursory overview, and I won't get too deep into them, but you guys need to know at least what is the major landmarks, what is normal, and then be able to say if something is abnormal or normal by just looking at it.